Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to work on two different proofs as practice of using this, and I will walk you through both of them. You'll have to forgive. I'm going to try and write with my mouse, and obviously that's a little bit hard to do, but I'm going to try to do as best I can, so forgive me if it's a little sloppy. Okay, let's take a look at this proof. We are given two pieces of information that A, here's the picture, A is the midpoint of FM. You see FM is this segment there. That is the segment FM. So A is the midpoint of FM, and it's also the midpoint of TN, which is that segment right there. Okay, so we're given that A is the midpoint of FM and TN. And of course, what we're trying to prove is that triangle fat is congruent to triangle man. Okay, so let's look at, anytime you're doing a proof, what you should do is always look at the picture and try and understand what these statements mean so that you have some idea of what you're trying to do. Proofs, like I said the other day, are never going to be the case where you're going to look at them and be like, oh yes, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. They're like puzzles. So you have to start with what you know, gather all the information that you can, and then just go one step at a time. If you see a step to take it. So we need to look at the picture and see what these two things mean. Obviously, we talked about what A being the midpoint looks like, and we're trying to prove that this triangle right here, that triangle right there, is congruent to this triangle right here, okay, to that triangle. All right, that is what we're trying to prove. So what does it mean that these two triangles are congruent? Well, we now know three ways to prove that two triangles are congruent. The three ways that we know of are, one, to prove that all corresponding sides are congruent and all corresponding angles are congruent, in order to prove that 6 different things are congruent, like this. Okay, so we could prove that. So we could try and say, okay, well, let's just prove that everything in this triangle is congruent to everything in this triangle. But as we've also just learned, we can use the SSS congruence. So we could try and use the fact that try and prove that all 3 sides are congruent, like that. If we get to here, we can say, okay, then we know by the side congruence that those two triangles are congruent. Or we can use SAS, side, angle, side, that 2 sides are congruent, and then the included angle. Okay, so as with any proof, we're going to start with what we know. So the only thing that we know is that A is the midpoint of FM and TN. That's all we know. So that has to be our first statement. And that's given. And then we should look at, okay, what does this actually mean in our picture? Well, here's what it means. If A is directly between F and M, then it means that this segment is congruent to this segment, right? That if A directly cuts in half FM, then FA has to be congruent to AM. And then similarly, if A is the midpoint of TN, then we know for certain that TA has to be congruent to AN. So from this first statement, our second statement naturally follows, and that's this. FA is congruent to AM, and TA is congruent to AN. And then the reason is we just have to be able to say where this came from. Well, we knew that this was true by the definition of what midpoint is. So our reason would just be definition of midpoint. Okay? Now, we have to take a look at our picture and see if we notice anything else. Okay, some of you should be saying, well, like we had in class the other day, we have the intersection of two lines. You can see it. There's one line, there's another line, and anytime we have the intersection of two lines, we know that vertical angles are going to be formed. So you can see that this angle and this angle right there are two vertical angles. And what do we know are congruent? What do we know is true about vertical angles? We know that vertical angles are congruent. So our next statement, just from looking at the picture, would be that angle FAT. So I'm going to be very specific because this would technically be angle A on both sides. I'm going to be very specific. Angle FAT is congruent to angle MAN, and that's because vertical angles are congruent. Vertical angles are congruent. And look what we have. We can now say that triangle FAT is congruent to triangle MAN because we have proven side angle side congruence. We've proven that two sides are congruent and the angle that is in between our two corresponding sides. So there we did it. We did it in 4 steps instead of 5. I think when I originally wrote this, I had split these two apart into their own statements, so that's why there are 4 instead of 5. But that's it. That is a proof of these two triangles being congruent. Okay, now, in your notes, you should have this proof right here, and this is a long proof. What I want you to do is we're actually going to walk through this together, but I want you to start it on your own. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at this picture, figure out what this means, and add anything here to our picture, and then I want you to try and come up with what the first 4 statements are. What are the first 4 statements and what are their reasons? And when you have that, I want you to come up and check those with me. Okay? So try this proof. And remember, if you don't see what to do right away, that is okay. We do not need to freak out. Just start with what you know. You shouldn't see the whole path in one step. And in fact, when I do proofs, I almost never know exactly where I need to go, but I know I can start somewhere and then go from there. Okay, so try that. And we're writing 2-column proofs today, but I want to show you that we also could use paragraph proofs. We could make the same argument and just write it as a paragraph. However you would prefer to write proofs, I don't mind. Sometimes some people prefer the columns because it's easier for them to see. But just know that you can totally write paragraph proofs and just use the same arguments, and that works as well. Okay? All right, so give this a shot, and then when you're done, come check it with me.